Hey guys, my name is Joshua Atanasio, and I'm covering hemispatial neglect from Chapter 6. In Chapter 6, we were introduced to Ellen, a patient of Ramachandran's, who showed symptoms of what was to be diagnosed as neglect syndrome. For the most part, Ramachandran, his proposed theories and explanations for what was going on in the brain of individuals with neglect syndrome is relatively accurate in relation to what we now know about it. He fell short on a couple of aspects. He claimed that there couldn't be right-sided neglect, so damage to the left hemisphere, and we now know there have been cases of individuals with lesions of the left hemisphere that have led to right-sided neglect, as well as, typically neglect is contralateral to the damaged area. There have been cases of neglect ipsilateral, and that was a fact that Ramachandran he was not aware of at the time. So neglect syndrome, also known as hemispatial neglect and unilateral neglect, is a neuropsychological condition predominantly associated with damage to one side of the cerebral hemisphere, and in particular to critical parietal and frontal lobe regions. Individuals who sustain injury to this area commonly exhibit what could be considered a deficit of attention and a complete lack of visual awareness of stimuli in the space contralateral to the damaged hemisphere. In other words, people who have hemispatial neglect have an inability to perceive and process stimuli on one side of their body to the extent as which the contralesional sensory space is non-existent entirely. For example, individuals with right hemispatial neglect, with damage to the right hemisphere, will run into things on their left side, like tables or any large objects, because they fail to see them there. And as seen in the book, Ellen, she only applied makeup to the right side of her face, leaving the left completely without makeup. What's more is that neglect can affect the memory. Patients with neglect have been asked to remember what a certain object looks like, to recall it, and to draw it. And without fail, only the right side of the object will get drawn. The left side will not exist. I think the book talked about the clock, asking patients to draw a clock. They will draw the circle entirely. And that's because drawing circles is so ingrained in our memory that it doesn't even affect neglect patients. They can still draw an entire circle. But when it comes to drawing the digits, the numbers, they will go 12, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then stop there. Or they will try to squish in the 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, all on the right side, still leaving the left hand blank. A very important note to make, though, is that neglect syndrome does not necessarily indicate a primary motor or sensory disorder, nor is it blindness in any way. Visual pathways remain intact and undamaged, and we know this is the case because of tests such as the house on fire test that is given to neglect patients. Basically, there's drawings of two houses. The one on top has the houses are identical, but the one on top has fire and smoke coming out of the left side of the windows, and patients are asked to they're asked if they're different or identical, and always they say that they're identical. But when asked of, well, which house would you prefer to live in, they all say that they would prefer to live in the one that was not on fire. Something unconsciously, they knew that something was wrong with the house on top, but they just didn't see it. They were neglecting to pay attention to it. Although neglect syndrome does indeed manifest itself in the visual, olfactory, auditory, proprioceptive, sensory networks of the brain, it does so in a way that is essentially a complete failure at paying attention to the stimuli, and not necessarily because of an actual deficit in sensory functioning. So is that the answer then? Is it neglect syndrome just a failure at paying attention? Ramachandran stated, to say neglect arises from the failure to pay attention doesn't necessarily tell us very much unless we have a clear notion of what the underlying neural mechanisms might be. And as it turns out, he's very correct. And it pegs the question, what is really going on up there? Is it a deficit in spatial working memory? Is it an impairment in selective attention? Is the patient unconsciously or implicitly processing neglected information? These are all questions that may be able to be answered by looking at the regions of the brain where the damage occurred that caused neglect in the first place. When it comes to neglect, an entire network of systems is involved, and when one of those systems is damaged, the entire network becomes fractured. Cortical damage involving the posterior parietal cortex, more specifically the right inferior parietal lobe, and the nearby temporal parietal junction have been the regions traditionally implicated in causing neglect. This area is responsible for creating a sensory representation of extrapersonal events and for targeting specific stimuli. It's also involved in integrating audio, visual, somatosensory inputs. So naturally, damage to this region of the parietal lobe can produce many sensory motor deficits, such as the perception and memory of spatial relationships in reaching and grasping correctly, as seen in the patients with mirror agnosia, in control of eye movement, and of course in attention. Additionally, research has shown that lesions of subcortical regions, such as the thalamus or basal ganglia, may also be involved in causing neglect. Not only that, but damage to the right frontal lobe alone could potentially be associated with neglect syndrome as well. And most recent studies implicate that even lesions of connecting white matter pathways can be found in individuals with neglect. Some other systems thought to be involved include primary sensory areas, the limbic system, which may explain why neglect affects the memory as well as attention, and the reticular activating system, frontal eye fields, and the nearby adjacent premotor areas. Thus, many neglect patients tend to have different regional combinations of damage. And it's entirely possible that this heterogeneity may be a key factor in determining the diversity of dysfunction reported in neglect syndrome. But one thing can be said with certainty, though, and that is that a single lesion to the right parietal lobe is no longer the only region associated with neglect syndrome as we had previously thought.